been a few incidences, one with a burner, which my partner ended up throwing out of the hut and then putting what he thought was a wool jersey over it to smother it, and the whole thing sort of melting.
Kia ora, and welcome to The Tramping Life, a podcast about hiking in Aotearoa, New Zealand, or as we call it here, tramping. I'm Eugenie, and in each episode I chat with people who share a passion for exploring this incredible country. We'll hear about the tracks they love, the huts they return to, the lessons they've learned, and what keeps them heading back into the bush. My guest today is Eugenie Sage, former Minister of Conservation and long-time environmental advocate. She has played a key role in protecting New Zealand's natural heritage and strengthening conservation policy. I'm delighted to welcome her to the podcast. Kia ora.
Kia ora, John T.
I'd like to start with people's first memories of the outdoors.
I grew up in Auckland and there was a gully with a stream at the bottom, so we had a fairly free-range childhood. Was the oldest of three younger brothers, and so there was just a lot of huts and forts and mucking around in the bush, really.
Do you remember when you started getting into tramping?
Went on an overnight trip at the Pinnacles, Karearea Valley in Coromandel. I think it was in the last year at secondary school with three of our fathers, and I still remember quite a long slog up the hill and some of my school friends carrying some tinned food, I think, and wondering why their packs were so heavy. But I didn't really do a lot of tramping as a young person, as a family. We were more into sailing. We had holidays in the Rotorua Lakes area, and again, just going off for most of the day, being able to wander through the bush, coming home when we were hungry.
And later on in life, you got a bit more into the tramping?
Yes, trekking in Nepal, low level, when I took a year up from university, and then coming back to do a diploma in journalism down in Canterbury. The flat I was in, I think my second overnight trip was up the Horden Edwards, and it was pouring with rain. We'd camped in the Horden and just going up to try and walk past, it was just hosing down. So I've got photographs of some very miserable four of us, very wet, retreating down the valley. But it wasn't really until post-university job on the West Coast working for the then Forest Service, the environmental forestry section, and just being based in Hokitika and having that amazing outdoor experiences just on our doorstep, really, and just exploring the coast, going biking, a little bit of caving, and quite a lot of tramping.
What do you think has been the most challenging tramp you've done, whether physically, mentally, or logistically?
The most challenging tramps have always involved hot weather. One particular one was going from Murchison up to Lake Matiri, then up onto the 1,000-acre plateau, and then going down Larrikin Creek into the Mokakihinui. And it was just a really hot afternoon. We missed the route, ended up scrabbling down. There are just these boulders as big as houses, really prickly olearia. So having to go up and over and down and getting scratched and being really hot, and just arriving in Larrikin Creek finally just utterly exhausted. I think we camped overnight, and then the next day going down into the Mokakihinui. The forest there, I don't think I'd seen rimu trees that tall, and it was just such spectacular forest. So the memories of the previous day melted away.
So what's the closest you've ever come to activating a PLB?
The only injury, touch wood, I've had was actually in the Travers Valley on just about flat terrain, daydreaming along at the end of a tramp, slipping, gashing my head, not a major wound, but a lot of blood. A good school friend who was a doctor was with me. She wasn't pleased because her partner with first aid kit was miles down the track, and I didn't have a very good first aid kit. Well, it was all fine, but it reminded me to always be alert and not to take anywhere for granted, even valley floor tracks, which shouldn't pose any risks. So that was a very stupid thing, just tripping and gashing head on a rock. But yeah, it was in a very benign environment. So be alert, I guess I've taken from that.
That's understandable. I think statistically, most accidents happen towards the end of the day when you're tired, when you're trying to get to the hut.
And there have been a few incidences. One with a burner, which my partner ended up throwing out of the hut and then putting what he thought was a wool jersey over it to smother it, and the whole thing sort of melting. But fortunately, that did not set anything on fire. And always really careful around burners, and always quite worried about the flammability of those.
And do you have any favourite huts or campsites?
I think Bob's hut in the Matakitaki, and Sean Barnett and Rob Brown and Jess Spearpoint have got a lovely story about Bob's hut in Shelter from the Storm, because I wondered who Bob was, because it's this very cute hut built by the Forest Service in the late 1950s. So it's that sort of original hut design. I think it's now 8 bunks. And just its location close to the river, looking up to the mountains, beech forest behind, and the size of it and scale and its heritage. So that's probably a favourite. It's been some good campsites. Again, 1,000 Acre Plateau, just under the beech forest there with some of those creeks. Recently did the St. James, and the Anne Hut, I think it was built about 10, 11 years ago. Somebody had scratched on the nameplate, the most exposed hut in New Zealand, because the winds come whistling round it. But I thought it was just stunning. It's been so well looked after. It still looks almost brand new. And because there was snow on the mountains and just the wide expanse of landscape around it, and this little dot in the middle, it was quite a charming hut. And very comfortable after a day out in the cold and the wind.
But there's a bit of a downside in terms of some of the environmental damage you saw.
Yes, I'd last walked the St. James probably about 30-odd years ago, and spring is an amazing time to walk it, chilly, but with snow, it just really adds contrast to the landscapes. But was really appalled by the amount of pig damage, particularly around really ancient matakauri. And St. James, I was working for Forest and Bird at the time, and we, with FMC, took Helen Clark and the then Lands Minister John Tamahere up in a plane over St. James, and felt while walking extraordinarily grateful to Helen Clark, because it was one of the last acts of that Labor government to purchase the 73-odd thousand hectares of St. James for 40 million, I think, at the time. A lot of criticism from the farmers, but because the Stevenson family had been very conservative in their farming regime and they didn't want intensive development, that purchase has safeguarded it from intensive farming development. And so, yes, you can see horses which are still run there, but the damage now is from wild ungulates. And the pig damage, just huge amount of rooting around the matakauri. And it's not many places in Canterbury where you can see such tall and old matakauri, which I would imagine would be several hundred years old. And the rooting will just completely destabilise and kill them. The whole focus of predator-free New Zealand has been on possums, rats, stoats, but we should be doing that as well as focusing on ungulate control and investing a lot more in pig control and deer control. And even on the Port Hills, you can see pig rooting damage. Pest-Free Banks Peninsula's got a really good initiative to do control with remote sensing and trapping, which has been proving very effective. Central government needs to invest much more to protect these landscapes that we enjoy. There's no point just in the big features being protected if we're not also protecting the diversity of the vegetation.
And I remember when I walked St. James last year, Canadian geese also seemed to be quite a big issue.
Yeah, Canada geese, that was again, Federated Farmers lobbied government to take the responsibility of Canada geese management away from Fish and Game. So no one is responsible for their management. Numbers have just exploded, and like you, was really concerned to see the fouling of wetlands and riparian areas and streams just from massive numbers of Canada geese.
Now, on a more positive note regarding wildlife, have you had any memorable wildlife encounters?
One of the most memorable recently was just on a day walk to Tasman Lakes at Aoraki, Mount Cook, and I just noticed a flicker of movement and thought, maybe that's a karearea falcon. Went over and got one, flew down this little gully. It's in the boulderlands and mosslands, and then we got within about 2 to 3 metres, and I was crouched down, and because apparently if you are below, they don't feel threatened. So we were able to just sit there for about 15 minutes and watch it, just preening, and just this really memorable vista of the Aora landscape, the valley, and then the falcon perched on a rock. So that was, pretty special being able to get that close. And another one was actually at Cape Brett. There's a great tramp out to the lighthouse there, which Te Papa Atapai has restored. It's a wonderful place to stay. And then climbing down, and I'd just taken some swimming goggles, and the fish life there was better than at the Poor Knights because of the impacts of the Kinner Barrens there, because of the impacts of the invasive urchin. Not the New Zealand one, it's an Australian one. Being able to do that, just go down and see all these fish that you don't normally see on the Canterbury coast anyway, was very cool.
You retired as an MP a couple of years ago. Are you still involved in what's going on?
Yes, stood down in October 2023. Have tried to live a bit, more opportunities to go tramping, trying to grow more vegetables and fruit, looking after a 2-year-old. I don't have children, but it's a son of a nephew, and he's just amazing. Just the way their small brains just develop and grow. Have been making quite a few submissions just on some of the Game Animal Council amendments, which would allow herds of special interest to be established in national parks. That's just been reported back from Select Committee with largely unchanged. And that then creates a real disincentive for DOC to do aerial 1080 control, and we'll see, I think, priority given to management of ungulates rather than Indigenous biodiversity in our national parks, with the proposals for establishment of at least 3 herds of special interest for deer and the like. And also the proposals for modernising, quote unquote, conservation legislation, made quite a substantive submission on that, as did a number of others. New Zealand Conservation Authority, the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, the NGOs, EDS and Forest and Bird. I see those proposals as very dangerous because they are all about streamlining the current legislation, making it much easier for commercial opportunities in national parks and protected lands, making it much easier for 60% of the conservation estate to be exchanged or potentially sold. If you've got a developer with high impacts, some of the subdivision tourist type lodge proposals, a gondola proposal in Franz Josef, they may well want to acquire conservation lands so that they have fewer restrictions on their commercial activities than to seek a concession. So the land exchange and disposal provisions, the proposals in the discussion document, were very troubling. And streamlining generally means cutting out opportunities for the public to have a say about how public conservation lands should be managed. The legislation does need review because National Parks Act, Conservation Act, the National Parks Act doesn't have a treaty clause or any treaty commitments. There are a lot of challenges, but the department has more responsibilities under treaty settlements than any other Crown agency. And the conservation estate, as 30% of Aotearoa, is the place where mana whenua can really practice the whole responsibility to tile. So we have got a responsibility to keep it in public ownership, to fully implement the treaty, to modernise the legislation, yes, but what this government is doing just tramples all over the treaty and also makes it much easier for commercial development. So I think we'll see a major attack when the legislation is actually introduced. When you've got ministers like Shane Dones just trashing endemic species and saying they can just be exploited, nature can be exploited, then there is just absolutely no commitment to or recognition of the importance of Indigenous nature to our economic, social and physical well-being. The late Jim Bolger, he and Bill Birch were trampers. So you had, even in a Conservative government, and Conservative and conservation have a similar root, there was a commitment to protection. Karearea National Park was established under the Bolger government. You just don't see that under this government. It's all about economic activity, not even growth.
I was going to ask, because back in the day you worked with Helen Clark as Press Secretary when she was Minister of Conservation, and I'd be interested to understand how, I guess, the politics around conservation changed over that time.
I think then the department was new. The whole joining up of the green dots within the Forest Service, New Zealand Lands and Survey and the Wildlife Service was new. There were teething issues. Paparoa National Park was just being established. There was more of a recognition of the need to protect parts of Aotearoa from exploitation. It wasn't couched in the terms of Indigenous biodiversity, but the importance of place. Now, I think the politics are just a total contempt for nature. And whether it's in the marine environment or on land, there's just nothing done to actually advance protection. Whereas back in the late 80s, yes, there were the major changes that the fourth Labour government put in place economically. Under Helen Clark, the Banks Peninsula Marine Mammal Sanctuary was established because of the evidence of Liz Sluton and Steve Dawson doing their PhD thesis about how many dolphins were being caught by fishers, because they were the first people to actually interview about what was really happening. Some of the issues haven't really changed. There was a lot of resistance by fishers then to the establishment of the sanctuary, but acting on the scientific advice that was established. When I was minister and we reviewed the marine mammals threat management plan for Hector's dolphin, there was a lot of work done on that. There was similar, really strong resistance from fishers, but we did strengthen the sanctuary areas, we expanded them, increased the areas that were free of set nets and trawling. So some of the issues are enduring, but the politics, I think, at the moment does not recognise that we depend on nature for our well-being. It's incredibly short-sighted.
Do you see the relationship with hunters? Has that changed over time, or was that always going to be that tension?
I think particularly when I drew the department's attention and pushed really hard for control of Himalayan tahr, because their population had been allowed to expand to up to 30,000, which was 3 times what the statutory plan said the population should be. The misogynistic attacks on me and others were a level of ferocity because of social media that I don't think you found earlier. There was much more synchronicity between hunters as just recreational users of public conservation lands in the same way that trampers, walkers, campers, others are. But now there's been a much greater politicisation to push for hunting above all else. Hunting's a really important recreational activity, but the political power which certain organisations have sought is to the exclusion of biodiversity often and other users.
Does that relate into some of the powers that the Game Animal Council are going to have? It's
a bit puzzling that 2 statutory organisations, the Game Animal Council and Fish and Game New Zealand, were mobilising submissions, DOC encouraging submissions on documents it puts out, but it doesn't go around telling people what they should write in their submissions, and yet those 2 statutory bodies were doing that. And the Game Animal Council is seeking a lot of power for itself to dictate how public conservation lands should be managed. And because that will be primarily for hunter purposes, biodiversity will suffer. There has been publicity recently about hunters providing food banks with meat, which is a great initiative by those hunters involved. But I think there's very little recognition of the increasing presence of ungulates and the damage they are doing. As Minister, one of the things I was proudest of was the work done on Raukumara Paemonga and the establishment of that initiative and the funding of 30-odd million, because Te Whānau Apanui and Ngāti Porou, alongside Papa Atawhai, had recognised the impact of deer damage in those Raukumara forests and the erosion that was associated with that and the need to actually bring deer numbers down as well as possum numbers. That being a really good example of a partnership between iwi and the Crown to make that happen.
Also on a positive note around Jobs for Nature, I'd be interested in what learnings you think we could take away from Jobs for Nature and whether that's something the future government could be encouraged to do.
There was a very good 3-year evaluation of Jobs for Nature done by Allen and Clark, a consultancy that specialised in research and evaluation. They highlighted some of the issues that I'd become aware of through the program. It was very difficult for any of the organisations getting funding in terms of reporting. It was quite burdensome because the Jobs for Nature, one of its critical successes, I think, was the collaboration across MPI, MFE and DOC. But they each had different systems and each demanded different metrics in reporting, which was very burdensome for organisations that were receiving any funding. So I think that needs to be sorted. But I think the benefits of having a cross-government partnership in the environmental space are huge. Agencies did control some of their own streams of money, like MFE was specialising in freshwater and initiatives there. But it enabled capacity building, particularly amongst iwi and hapu, so that should continue in any new program. There should probably be a closer look at the biodiversity values of projects. The focus was very much on jobs because of COVID and that environment, and so making sure that all of the projects have got a real biodiversity value. I think the ones that worked the best were partly where they built on existing partnerships that DOC had with iwi hapu, with regional councils, so it was putting money into where there were relationships. It did enable an enormous increase in skill and capacity, and the tragedy is that it hasn't been continued. So it's quite difficult for organisations which geared up over that 3 to 4 year period, and then the funding just disappeared. We talk about infrastructure. Well, nature is our key infrastructure. We need to invest in nature-based solutions in the climate adaptation space, and the Jobs for Nature program was a way of doing that while engaging between central local government, iwi hapu and community organisations. So it's a good model, and this evaluation report has some very practical ideas of how it could be improved for a future one.
Now, thinking back on your career as an MP, what are some of the biggest kind of wins that you're proud of?
You only ever achieve a win if you're working with a lot of others. And I think it was working with Forest and Bird and the whole movement to stop the Timberlands beach scheme, to stop logging and to actually end logging on state-owned, Crown-owned lands. And that was a very big campaign, Native Forest Action doing the tree sits, Forest and Bird doing a lot of the advocacy with trying to find ways to tie it up through the RMA and advocacy just about the values of the forests. When a Labor government was elected in 1999, one of the first things they did was to announce a halt to the beach scheme, and then the winding up of timberlands, and then later in about 2002, the transfer of 30,000 hectares of timberlands managed land to the Department of Conservation. That was a huge achievement, but that was achieved by a mass movement, thousands of people getting involved around the country, lots of media coverage. So being part of that, I think, it is, when people work together, they can make a difference. And then I guess with tenure review, working with Forest and Bird, making endless submissions after a lot of walking around and field inspections on pastoral leases, that areas deserve protection when they were being proposed for freeholding. And yes, we did get high country conservation parks out of that, but because there was such extensive freeholding, over 330,000 hectares, and Dr. Anne Brower's analysis of just how much the Crown and the public were losing, as a Minister of Lands, being able to develop, introduce and pass legislation to stop tenure review and stop that privatisation process. So, it's being involved in movements that actually seek change, because government initiatives don't just happen because a minister thinks it's a good idea. It's usually a result of quite a lot of public pressure and mobilisation.
There's quite a tension between, I guess, tourism and the impact and the trade-offs with the conservation estate, and some ideas around things like charging for national parks, or entry to national parks. I wonder what your thoughts are on how we make this sustainable.
So that was a major initiative in 2018, I think it was, where we got the International Visitor Levy established. And that is an efficient way of enabling tourists to contribute to the funding of nature and of tourism infrastructure. Problem is, because of our free trade and other agreements, CER, Australians don't qualify. So support the government raising the levy to $100, but it's not being invested according to the same principles when the visitor levy was established, which was a 50-50 split between conservation and tourism infrastructure. Now we see a few drabs of conservation. So I think something like that at the border is much more effective and fairer than having charges to national parks, because I think that will encourage non-compliance. You don't have roads going into all national parks where you could have a toll gate, maybe Aoraki, and it happens in the US and Australia, but I'm not sure how we get around this issue of the fact that Australians, as our biggest visitor market, don't pay under the IVL. The department looking at parking fees, I think, is good. They should never have allowed places like Whitehorse Hill and Aoraki to be open to camper vans. We want our tourism nodes to be in towns, areas outside of our protected areas network, because you've already got the infrastructure there, and any increase in the infrastructure should be in those towns because then it benefits the locals. But what we potentially see with National Act, New Zealand First Government's proposed legislative change, is much more commercial development on our protected lands.
Recently, you went to the premiere of a film about Denison at Parliament. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Forest and Bird and 350 Aotearoa and others are campaigning hard for the protection of the Denison Plateau. It's an extraordinary landscape. There's wonderful mountain biking and walking there. These huge sandstone pavements, tiny bonsai-like ata, rimu, because the growing conditions are so inhospitable up there. Cold, wet, plants grow really slowly, hence they're small. Great spotted kiwi in higher numbers there than other places because the predators don't survive very well in these conditions either. And yet what Bathurst, Australian coal mining company, is proposing is to extend the Stockton mine, which is the only mine you can see from satellites in Aotearoa, and it's taken most of the Stockton Plateau, to extend that into the Dennis Plateau. And it would just mean the utter destruction of these really spectacular landscapes and biodiversity. It is a biodiversity hotspot, which Forest and Bird is calling for scientific reserve status to recognise those values. And just launched a film, about the Denison Plateau, and it's available on YouTube, or there's a link on the Forest and Bird website. So if you haven't had the opportunity to visit, you'll be inspired by the landscapes by watching this film.
Now, to finish up with, what's on your tramping bucket list?
Doing the Old Ghost Road next month, which will be interesting because I think it goes past close to where Larrikin Creek comes out, so it'll be interesting looking back there. Then I'm really looking forward to a 4-day trip on Hikarangi Maunga with the legendary Graham Atkins, who's a former dock ranger and just kaumātua and just ace botanist, in December. And then on the bucket list, would love to get back to Mount Owen. I just think the karst landscapes there are fantastic. I haven't done the Reese Dart. Lockett Range above the Cobb Valley on maps is just this whole scattering of amazing looking tarns, and I think there's a newish dock hut there on the way up too. That is on this summer's agenda. But even just getting out on the Port Hills, and there are just some stunning landscapes there.
Thank you so much for listening to The Tramping Life. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please follow the podcast in whatever app you use. Tell a friend about it and consider leaving a rating or a review. It really helps more people discover the show. If you have any questions or feedback, I'd love to hear from you. Drop me an email at thetrampinglife, one word, @gmail.com.